damage from IDF bulldozers. 17 Palestinians were killed and dozens were arrested. The Palestinian Authority's fiscal situation continued to be extremely precarious amidst broader economic concerns across the West Bank. Some 150,000 Palestinian workers have been unable to reach their jobs since Israeli imposed strict entry restrictions following the 7 October attacks. Mr. President, I remain concerned about the wider impact of the war in Gaza and the risk for escalation in the region. Daily exchanges of fire across the blue line have continued with the risk of miscalculation and escalation, posing a grave threat to regional stability. It is imperative that Lebanon not be dragged into regional conflagration and that the parties return to cessation of hostilities under the framework of Resolution 1701. Meanwhile, in the Red Sea, the Houthis in Yemen have targeted numerous vessels by boarding parties as well as by armed drones and missiles. Strikes have damaged a number of ships and other interdicted by US and other naval forces in the area, raising concerns over the safety of shipping through the vital trade artery. 4 major shipping companies have reportedly directed their vessel not to transit through the Red Sea, while Israel's Eilat port has reported an 80% drop in revenue since attacks began. Mr. President, I will now turn to several observations regarding the implementation of the provision of the Security Council Resolution 2334 during the reporting period. The violence that has taken place since 7 October in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, particularly in and around Gaza, has shaken the region and most tragically the lives of millions of Palestinians and Israelis. The violence has taken, I strongly condemn the abhorrent armed attacks by Hamas and others in Israel. Nothing can justify the acts of terror that were committed and the deliberate killing, maiming, and abduction of civilians and other protected persons. Accounts of the attacks reveal acts of brutality that are impossible to accept and comprehend. I am appalled by the report of sexual violence during the attacks. These must be vigorously investigated and prosecuted. The indiscriminate firing of rockets towards the Israeli population center, which continue to this day, is a violation of international humanitarian law and must cease completely. I welcome the release of 110 Israeli and foreign hostages and reiterate that all remaining hostages must be immediately and unconditionally released in line with UN Security Council Resolution 2712. The magnitude of hostilities between Israel and Hamas and the scope of death and destruction in Gaza have been unprecedented and unbearable to witness. I unequivocally condemn the killing of civilians in Gaza, including women and children. I mourn the loss of every civilian, including 131 UN colleagues, the single largest loss of life in the history of the organization. I remain gravely concerned by the impact of the ongoing hostilities on the humanitarian situation in Gaza. The current conditions are making it impossible for meaningful humanitarian operations to be conducted. I'm also deeply concerned by escalating tensions in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Intensified armed exchanges between Palestinians and Israeli security forces, predominantly in the context of Israeli operations, have led to exceedingly high levels of fatalities and arrests. I reiterate that security forces must exercise maximum restraints and use lethal force only when it's strictly unavoidable to protect life. I am alarmed by the lethal attacks carried out by Israeli settlers against Palestinians and by Palestinians against the Israelis in the occupied West Bank and Israel. All perpetrators of violence must be held accountable and swiftly brought to justice. I am appalled by the numerous instances of officials glorifying violence, encouraging the killing of civilians. Such rhetoric is abhorrent and must be clearly rejected by leaders on all sides. Leaders have an obligation to clearly and explicitly condemn acts of terror and violence directed against the civilians. I remain deeply troubled by the relentless expansion of Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, that is impeding access to Palestinians to their land and resources and threatening the viability of a future independent Palestinian state. I reiterate that Israeli settlements constitute a flagrant violation of UN resolutions and international law and call on the government of Israel to cease the advancement of all settlement activity immediately. Mr. President, this war has once again served as a devastating and tragic reminder that there is no substitute for a legitimate political process that will resolve the core issues driving the conflict. It is critical that this important junction to enable the parties to re-engage on the long-delayed political path to a two-state solution. I urge Israelis, Palestinians, the states of the region and the broader international community to work together towards this goal. The UN efforts to support this objective has already begun through active consultations in the region. Our work must continue. The UN remains committed to supporting Palestinians and Israelis in ending the occupation and resolving the conflict in line with international law, relevant UN resolutions and bilateral agreements in pursuit of the two-state, Israel, and an independent, democratic, viable and sovereign Palestinian state, of which Gaza is an integral part, living side by side in peace and security with its secure and recognized border, on the basis of the 1967 lines with Jerusalem as the capital of both states. I thank you.
Agradezco al señor
I
Thor
thank
Wennesland
Mr.
por la
Thor
información que ha
Wennesland
proporcionado.
for his briefing.
Doy ahora la palabra
I
al
now
general
give
de
the floor to
división
Major
Patrick
General
Gauchat.
Patrick Gauchat.
Thank you, Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished members of the Security Council. I'm grateful for the opportunity to address the Council, sharing the perspective of the United Nations Truth Supervision Organization, UNTSO, on the situation in the Middle East. Mr. President, the events of Saturday, 7 October surprised, shocked, and appealed everyone, and the conflict they have triggered continued to reverberate in the region. Since UNTSO does not have a person presence in and around Gaza or southern Israel, UNTSO personnel were not in a position to observe directly the events of the 7 October or developments since. But those events have assuredly impacted our operations and regional dynamics. Mr. President, the history of UNTSO goes back 75 years. On May 29, 1948, this Council called for cessation of hostilities in Palestine under Resolution 50. This truce was to be supervised by a UN mediator assisted by a group of military observers that would become known as United Nations Truth Supervision Organization, the first peacekeeping mission in the history of United Nations. In 1949, with the signing of 4 armistice agreements, one between Israel and each of its Arab neighbors, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and the Syrian Arab Republic, the Council declared the role of the mediator complete and transferred the role of supervising the implementation of the armistice agreement to the Chief of Staff, UNTSO. In addition, UNTSO was also tasked with assisting the parties in their application and observance until the peaceful adjustment of the future situation of Palestine. That two-part mandate remains the basis for UNTSO's presence to this day and is accomplished through 1, deploying expert military observers to maintain unconditional ceasefires, and 2, maintaining a strong regional liaison with host nations. Mr. President, on the operational level, from 8 October, many ceasefire violations have occurred across the blue line between Israel and Lebanon, and then on the Golan between Israel and the Syrian Arab Republic. UNTSO's military observer, who constitute Observe Group Lebanon, or GL, and Observe Group Golan, OGG, under the operational control of the UN Interim Force in Lebanon, UNIFIL, and the UN Disengagement Observer Force, UNDOF, respectively, took appropriate and adapted security measures. They continue to fulfill the critical role of assuring accurate military reporting, accurate military observation, investigation of ceasefire violations, inspection on the Golan. And these reportings enable liaison with the parties, including for the purpose of de-escalating tensions. During the last few weeks, the adaptations were mainly logistic, security, rotation, and deployment of personnel. Since 8 October, the military crossing points, which UNTSO uses between Israel and Lebanon, as well as between the Israeli-occupied Golan and the Syrian-controlled Golan, has been closed. Similarly, the access points to the closed observation post, located just after the IDF technical fence on the Golan, were sealed, impeding the rotations and the logistical support. Through good dialogue with the parties, UNTSO was able to put in place the minimum required support and security for the deployed military observer. In southern Lebanon, where a very clear escalatory pattern is observed, UNTSO military observer in OGL still conduct blue line patrols every day, taking calculated risks. As part of the wider work conducted by UNIFIL, this international presence influences restraint by the parties in their kinetic activities. Our female military observers are key in connecting with local women and children across the area where UNTSO is deployed, noting our exemplary percentage of female officers, 22% in the mission. The everyday liaison function of UNTSO military observers include engaging with local population, local leaders, and military commanders. I want here to add that their presence during the current tensions in South Lebanon is reassuring for the local population. Mr. President, in parallel with the work of the military observers on the ceasefire lines, UNTSO maintains liaison offices in Cairo, Beirut, and Damascus, as well as in Jerusalem for Jordan and Israel. UNTSO regional liaison mandate allows the mission to analyze and address complex issues, especially those not covered by other missions operating in the region, whether peacekeeping or SPMs. It also allows us to be in direct contact with the 5 parties, and I want to stress a very good contact with all 5 parties, passing messages and establishing tactical confidence-building measures. I have done that numerous times since 7 of October. In each of the capitals of the 5 hosting countries of UNTSO that I have visited, authorities have shared their view on the regional situation as well as on the ceasefires in which UNTSO is involved through OGL and OGG. For instance, on the Blue Line area, officials of both Israel and Lebanon communicated to me their willingness to improve security and implementation of the Security Council Resolution 1701. On the Golan, both Israel and Syria mentioned to me their very strong will to keep the armistice in place, and they also shared their concerns and their expectation of the peacekeeping system. On this basis, I shared, of course, these messages with the parties and my relevant UN colleagues, as this contributes to the overall effort of the United Nations for peace in the region. During these exchanges, I systematically try to diffuse potentially dangerous situations, clarify positions, and ensure my interlocutors that I would pass their messages. This was always well received by the parties. Mr. President, in conclusion, UNTSO continues to perform its regional mandate. You can rest assured that UNTSO is a vibrant mission of women and men, national and international, military and civilian, true to the concept of unarmed military observer mission, operating with the consent of the five countries and parties. As the regional situation evolves, we will continue to contribute towards the comprehensive, just and peaceful resolution of the situation in the Middle East, consistent with the mandates given by this Council. Thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco al general de
I
división
thank
Gochat
Major General
por la
Gauchat
información que ha
for his
proporcionado.
briefing.
Doy ahora la
I
palabra a
now
los
give the
miembros del
floor to
Consejo que
those
deseen
council
formular
members
una
who wish to
declaración.
make statements.
Tiene la palabra
I give the
el
floor
representante de Estados
to
Unidos.
the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Special Coordinator Venzlin and Head of Mission Gauchat, for your briefing. Colleagues, over the last few days and weeks, we have shared many of our thoughts on the subject, and we will have more to say later in the day. But right now, a few things bear reiterating. That the atrocities Hamas committed on October 7 must be condemned. That we must pursue justice for the victims of horrific sexual violence perpetrated by Hamas on and after that day. That Israelis still face barrages of rocket fire to this day, rocket fire launched by Hamas from civilian infrastructure in Gaza at civilians in Israel. That civilians must be protected, and that humanitarian aid must reach those who desperately need it. That Hamas must not be allowed to control Gaza for the sake of Israeli and Palestinian safety alike, and that Israel has the right to protect its people from terrorism. That regional actors, including the Houthis, must not exploit and widen this conflict. That UNRWA must be supported, and the United States has provided more than $422 million to its 2023 appeals to that end. And that ultimately, we must all work towards a two-state solution, which serves as the only foundation for a truly sustainable peace. Of course, as Special Coordinator Venzlin highlighted, the events that have unfolded in the West Bank over the last year have moved us farther away from that reality. That includes the ongoing construction of settlements in the West Bank, which undermines the possibility of a Palestinian state. And it includes a sharp and alarming uptick in settler violence, especially because even before Hamas's attack on October 7, 2023 was the deadliest year for Palestinians in the West Bank since 2005. Colleagues, the United States condemns these violent attacks, period. We believe the perpetrators must be held accountable. As Secretary Blinken announced earlier this month, we will continue to issue visa bans to extremist individuals who have undermined peace, security, and stability in the West Bank. Already, we have implemented this policy for dozens of individuals and their families under this policy. And we have repeatedly underscored to the Israeli government that it, too, must do more to investigate this violence and hold extremist settlers who have committed it responsible. More than that, Israeli officials must not fan the flames of this violence with incendiary, dehumanizing rhetoric. Because we have seen the ways in which words have consequences, not only in the West Bank, but around the world. Over the past 2 months, we have witnessed a spike in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, both online and in our communities, including in our own backyard here in New York City, where just a few blocks north, a halal food vendor faced vile, bigoted harassment. Where just over the river in Brooklyn, a Jewish man was brutally beaten in front of his family's home. Rhetoric matters, and we must do more to prevent this dangerous dehumanization. There are 2 more subjects I want to address today. The first is what faces those reporting in the region. Because today, journalists are not just witnessing what is happening, they are experiencing it, all of it. Scores have lost family members, like Al Jazeera's Wael Dawdu, who was himself injured last week. Others have been displaced from their homes or gravely injured on the job. And far, far too many have been killed, making this the deadliest period in memory for journalists. Colleagues, there are few callings more noble than telling the truth. Journalists' words change hearts and minds and move people to action. And in this moment, more must be done to protect them. Colleagues, the final note I want to end on is about the hostages. Earlier this week, our mission met with young Israelis whose loved ones are still being held captive in Gaza. They came to us to share the stories of their loved ones, and we promised that we would tell those stories to this council, to the world. We heard from Amit and Mikhail Levy, whose sister, Nahama, was kidnapped by Hamas. So many of us have seen the video of her being forced into a jeep at gunpoint, her hands tied and her pants bloodied. But what so many of us don't know is Nahama's story, the fact that she was a peace activist who built connections with Palestinians in an effort to chart a brighter future, who dreamed of being a diplomat, and maybe even sitting in this very chamber, whose smile is missed every single day. We will continue to share Nahama's story and every hostage's story until they are home, until Amit and Mikhail can embrace their sister once again. Colleagues, we must hold space for the heartbreak on all sides, for all whose lives have been disrupted and destroyed by a conflict that Hamas set in motion, that Hamas restarted after a week-long humanitarian pause, and that Hamas could once again end by simply releasing the hostages. For all those who have suffered in Israel, in Gaza, in the West Bank, and around the globe, let us work in good faith to end this cycle of violence and sow the seeds for a lasting peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco al representante
I
de
thank
Estados
the
Unidos
representative
por
of the
su
United
declaración.
States for his statement.
Tiene ahora la palabra
I
la
now give the
representante
floor
de Japón.
to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Special Coordinator Venezueland, for your updates. And I thank Major General Gosha for sharing UNTSO's valuable activities. Japan expresses its grave concern over the worsening humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Following the resumption of fighting after the breakdown of the humanitarian pause, airstrikes and ground operations, especially in the southern Gaza Strip, have led to a significant number of civilian casualties. The total death toll in Gaza is approaching 20,000. Two-thirds of the victims are reportedly women and children. This must stop. UNRWA facilities are overcrowded, with displaced Palestinians. Hunger is alarmingly on the rise, and communicable diseases are rapidly spreading. As UNRWA's Commissioner General Lazzarini put it, everywhere you go, people are desperate, hungry, and terrified. It is critically important that Israel abide by international law, including international humanitarian law, in order to prevent harm to innocent civilians and basic civilian infrastructure. Japan also calls for all parties to act faithfully based on UN Security Council Resolution 2712. The amount of assistance crossing through Rafah is nowhere near enough. We note that the border crossing at Kerem Shalom is finally open for direct delivery of humanitarian assistance to Gaza. This will be a crucial lifeline to many, but as we heard from Special Coordinator, it is still too short for the needed. Mr. President, beyond Gaza, there remains a serious risk of regional spillover. Continued clashes on Israel's northern border could easily escalate with a single miscalculation. Missile launches and attacks on vessels by the Houthis are causing a considerable interruption to global shipping and threaten maritime security in the region. Of particular concern is the Galaxy Leader, which is a ship operated by the Japanese company that was seized and has been held along with its multinational crew by the Houthis for nearly a month. We strongly urge the Houthis to immediately and unconditionally release both the crew and the ship. Mr. President, meanwhile, in the West Bank, we observe with concern spiking settler violence and attacks on Israelis by Palestinians, which are inflaming the situation. Japan also calls once again on Israel to refrain from advancing settlement activities, which are a clear violation of international law and against relevant Security Council resolution. In conclusion, the international community must exert all its efforts to urgently alleviate the suffering in Gaza and end this tragedy. We can no longer ignore the root causes of the long-standing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Israel and an independent Palestinian state must live side by side in peace and security. We must heed the calls of voices around the world who wish to see these aspirations realized fully and decisively. There is simply no alternative. Now it's high time to act. I thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco a la
I
representante
thank
de
the
Japón por su
representative of Japan
declaración.
for her statement.
Tiene la
I
palabra
now
el
give the floor
representante
to the
de Brasil.
representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank Special Coordinator Wensland and General Gauchat for their briefings. Brazil deeply regrets that Resolution 2334 continues to be disregarded, a fact that only aggravates the negative trends imperiling the two-state solution. Regrettably, that is the case of almost every single resolution passed by this Council regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, not to mention those that were simply vetoed. As the world watches the appalling human toll of the ongoing war in Gaza with astonishment and powerlessness, settlement activities in contravention of international law have continued and expanded, relentlessly and undisturbed, throughout the occupied Palestinian territory in flagrant violation of international law and in defiance to the authority of this Council. We are deeply concerned by the increase in the displacement of Palestinians from their homes as a result of settlement activities, which only worsened after the 7th October terrorist attacks against Israel, as well as by the intensification of settler violence in the West Bank. State violence has been on the rise not just in Gaza. Demolitions, eviction orders, and other types of attacks against Palestinians and their households have further expanded in Palestinian land, including East Jerusalem. The latest Secretary General's report on the implementation of Resolution 2334 reminds us of the gravity of the situation, including the staggering numbers of victims and the amount of destruction caused by the war. Unprecedented levels of violence and destruction in a region already marked by serious instability have, in the latest reporting period, produced the deadliest record for both Israelis and Palestinians in the history of this 75-year-old conflict. UN officials, including the Secretary General, have also warned us about the imminent collapse of the humanitarian system in Gaza, prompted by military operations imperiling the safety of humanitarian workers and by decisions to limit the inflow of humanitarian aid to those in need. Our failure in responding to their call for help through a ceasefire and the scaling up of humanitarian aid has contributed to further loss of innocent lives. Mr. President, with its slow action, The Council has been condoning this never-ending cycle of violence and lawlessness for far too long. Our inability not just to pass meaningful resolutions, but also to enforce decisions already adopted, has created the impression that in the Middle East, the only law that matters is the law of the strongest. This state of affairs is not in the interest of anyone. On the contrary, it only breeds further violence and resentment. It also encourages contempt for the law and disbelief in the ability of the international community to deliver on its promise of and on its commitment to a two-state solution with Israel and a viable state of Palestine living side by side in peace and security within mutually agreed and internationally recognized borders. Our collective duty to advance durable peace in the Middle East requires from us now that we ensure respect for international law by all parties to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, including the protection of civilians, the immediate and unconditional release of hostages, and the delivery of humanitarian aid. In the occupied Palestinian territory as a whole, through justice, accountability and reconciliation, including by putting an end to the Israeli occupation that began in 1967 and the respect of all pertinent Security Council resolutions. Thank you.
Agradezco al
I thank
representante
the
de Brasil
representative
por su
of Brazil
declaración.
for his statement.
Tiene la
I
palabra
now
la
give the floor to
representante
the
de Suiza.
representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you,
Je
Mr.
voudrais
President.
commencer par remercier le coordinateur spécial Convenes
the special
et le
coordinator
général de
Convenes
division
and,
Patrick Gauchat
Major Patrick
pour leur
Gauchat
participation
for
à cette séance.
their participation in this
Nous
meeting.
saluons et remercions
We
leurs grands
welcome
efforts
their efforts and
en vue
thank
de faire
them
respecter le droit
for their efforts
international
to ensure
humanitaire
respect for
et des droits
international
humains,
humanitarian
ainsi que
human
de
rights
liaison
law
avec tous les
and to
acteurs
liaise with
régionaux
all regional
afin
actors
d'éviter une
to
escalade
avoid
régionale.
regional escalation.
Comme le rappelle le dernier
As
rapport du
the
secrétaire
Secretary
général,
General's
la
latest
résolution
reports point out,
2334 de
Resolution
ce Conseil
2334
condamne, et
of
je
the
cite,
Security Council
tous les
condemns,
actes
and
de
I quote,
violence visant
all
des
acts of
civils,
violence against
y
civilians,
compris les actes de
including
terreur,
acts of terror,
ainsi que tous les
as well
actes de
as
provocation,
all acts of provocation,
d'incitation à la violence et de
incitement, and
destruction.
destruction.
Dans cet esprit,
And
la
in this
Suisse a
spirit,
condamné les actes de
Switzerland
terreur commis
condemns
par le
the
Hamas le
act of
7
terror
octobre
committed by
dernier
Hamas
et
on
appelle
the 7th of
depuis à la
October and
libération
has since
immédiate et
called for the
inconditionnelle
immediate
des
and
otages.
unconditional
Le
release of the
secrétaire général
hostages.
condamne aussi
In
fermement
his
dans son
report, the Secretary
rapport
General
ces
also
actes de
strongly
terreur,
condemns
y
these
compris
acts
les
of terror,
prises d'otages,
including the
ainsi
taking
que
of
les violences
hostages
sexuelles
and the sexual
commises au
violence
cours des attaques par
committed
le
during
Hamas.
the attacks by Hamas.
Depuis,
Since
des
then,
milliers de civils
thousands
ont
of
tragiquement perdu
civilians
la vie
have
en
tragically
Israël
lost
et
their
encore
lives
beaucoup
in
plus
Israel
dans l'ensemble du
and many
territoire
more
palestinien occupé.
throughout the occupied
Le risque
Palestinian
de
territory.
régionalisation
The
du
risk
conflit
of the
reste
conflict
réel,
becoming
comme le
regional
montrent
remains
les
real,
tensions croissantes de
as is
part et
shown by the
d'autre de la
growing
ligne bleue.
tensions on both sides of the blue
La
line.
situation en
The
Cisjordanie et à
situation in the West
Jérusalem
Bank
Est le
and
démontre
in East
également.
Jerusalem also
Le
shows this.
nombre de morts
The
parmi les
number of
civils
deaths
y atteignait
amongst
déjà des
civilians
records
there was
effrayants
already
avant le 7
reaching
octobre.
frightening record
Depuis
highs
cette date,
before the
les
7th of
violences
October.
sont en hausse
Since then,
et,
violence
selon
has
l'ONU,
increased,
plus
and
de
according to the
250
UN, more than
Palestiniens,
250
dont un quart
Palestinians,
d'enfants,
a
ont
quarter of
été
them
tués.
children, have been killed.
Plus de 2/3 d'entre eux
More
sont
than
morts
two-thirds
lors
of them
d'opérations
died
israéliennes,
during Israeli
y inclut des
operations,
frappes aériennes et
including
des
airstrikes
incursions,
and
notamment dans les
incursions,
camps de
particularly in
Tulkarem,
the
de
Tulkarem,
Jenin et de
Jenin,
Balata.
and Balata camps.
La Suisse appelle Israël à
Switzerland calls on
respecter
Israel
ses
to
obligations de
respect its
droit
obligations
international
under
lors de telles
international law
opérations.
during such
En
operations.
particulier,
In particular,
l'usage de la
the use
force
of
doit
force
notamment
must
répondre
meet the
aux critères
criteria
de
of
nécessité et de
necessity and
proportionnalité
proportionality
et protéger
and
le droit
protect
de tout
every
individu à la vie
individual's right
et à la
to
sécurité de
life
sa
and
personne.
security of person.
En outre, nous
We
condamnons
also
les actes
condemn the
violents
violent
commis par des
acts
colons
committed
contre les
by
civils
settlers
palestiniens
against
qui
Palestinian
renforcent
civilians,
l'environnement
which
coercitif
reinforce
régnant
the
en
coercive
Cisjordanie.
environment prevailing in the West
Celui-ci
Bank.
a mené à la
This
mort
has
de
led to
plusieurs
the deaths of
Palestiniens,
several
au déplacement
Palestinians,
forcé
the
de plus
forced
d'un millier de
displacement of
civils
more than
et à la
1,000
destruction
civilians, and the
d'infrastructures
destruction of
essentielles
essential
depuis le 7
infrastructure
octobre.
since the 7th of October.
La montée de cette
The
violence est
escalation of this violence is
inacceptable.
unacceptable.
La Suisse rappelle les
Switzerland
obligations
recalls
d'Israël
Israel's
en vertu du droit
obligations under international
international, y
law,
compris
including the
l'obligation de
obligation
protéger
to
la
protect
population
the
civile.
civilian
Dans
population.
un environnement
In an
d'impunité
environment of
presque
near
complète,
complete
des
immunity,
enquêtes indépendantes
independent
doivent être
investigations
menées
must be
concernant
carried
toutes les
out into
violations du
all
droit
violations of
international
international law
afin
in
que
order
leurs
to bring
auteurs soient
the
traduits en
perpetrators
justice.
to justice.
En outre,
In
les
addition,
colonies
Israeli
israéliennes en territoire
settlements in the
palestinien
occupied
occupé
Palestinian
sont
territory
illégales au regard
are
du droit
illegal under
international
international
humanitaire,
humanitarian
comme
law,
mentionné dans la
as
résolution
mentioned in
2334.
Resolution
En tant que
2334.
puissance occupante,
As the occupying
Israël doit
power, Israel must refrain from taking any measures that would introduce permanent changes into the Palestinian territory. Mr. President, in Gaza today, the protection of civilians is not being respected. Aid remains insufficient. It must be increased. Its relevance must be ensured. And above all, the conditions must be created for its effective distribution throughout the Gaza Strip. We welcome the opening of Kerem Shalom and expect it to allow the entry of humanitarian and commercial goods via a variety of access routes. In view of the catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip, with a real risk of a collapse of the social order, we hope that this Council will be able to shoulder its responsibility and speak out in support of the Gazan civilian population in need. While we recognize Israel's right to ensure its defense and security, we call on the parties to the conflict to respect international humanitarian law, in particular to fulfill their obligations in the conduct of hostilities, and in particular to respect the principles of proportionality, distinction, and precaution in all circumstances. We must support any process that promotes peace and security. The full, equal, and meaningful participation of Palestinian and Israeli women is essential. The two-state solution is the only foundation for peace and stability in the region. We must help to rebuild this foundation for two democratic states, Israel and Palestine, of which Gaza is an integral part, living side by side in peace within secure and recognized borders. I thank you.
Agradezco a la
I
representante
thank
de
the
Suiza por
representative
su
of Switzerland
declaración.
for her statement.
Tiene ahora la
I now
palabra
give
el
the floor to
representante
the
de
representative
Mozambique.
of Mozambique.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Mozambique commend Ecuador's presidency for convening this briefing on the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. We extend our sincere gratitude to the briefers, Mr. Tor Winsland, UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, and Major General Patrick Gauchin, Head of the United Nations Truth Supervision Organization, for the insightful briefing on the Middle East peace and process. Mr. President, Mozambique, along with other members of the Council, has voiced grave concern regarding the situation in the Palestinian occupied territory. Specifically, we highlighted several critical issues such as the expansion of settlements, violence against civilians, inflammatory language, and other provocations between the parties. All these activities are flagrant violations under the international law and contribute to aggravate the tensions as well as an obstacle to the peace in the region. It is crucial for all parties involved to exercise maximum restraint, prioritize dialogue, and work towards de-escalating tensions. The international community must continue to advocate for a just and peaceful resolution to this long-standing conflict. Mr. President, we are deeply concerned by the worsening humanitarian crisis in Gaza. The ongoing conflict between Israeli forces and Palestinian armed groups has exacerbated the situation, leaving thousands of people in desperate need. Acknowledging the situation on the ground, Mozambique appreciates the tireless efforts of all stakeholders and the international community to advance the peace process. We therefore welcome several initiatives, including the high-level meetings hosted by Jordan, Egypt, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and the Saudi Arabia, United States of America, Muslim and Arab leaders, Organization of Islamic States, League of Arab States, among others, to address the current crisis. Mr. President, equally important is a demonstration of goodwill by both parties, and in this vein, the immediate release of hostages is of paramount importance. Let us collectively work towards a humanitarian pause and de-escalation of the conflict to safeguard lives and uphold human dignity. Given the dire situation, we call for immediate implementation of Resolution 2712 to ensure the timely delivery of vital goods and services for civilians' well-being and protection, especially children and women. There is an urgent need to scale up and improve humanitarian access into Gaza. Lives are at stake, and we have a duty to help the most vulnerable, including children and women. We believe that only an immediate suspension of hostilities can allow for the safe and hindered humanitarian access and the delivery of life-saving assistance to the desperate civilian population. Mozambique therefore fully supports the proposal for the UN Secretary General to establish a monitoring mechanism to confirm the humanitarian nature of aid consignments into Gaza. We believe that this will fast-track the delivery of humanitarian assistance. Mr. President, Mozambique's stance on the Israel-Palestinian conflict is well known and emanates from its conviction that the two-state solution remains fundamental for achieving lasting peace and harmony in the region. This necessitates a common effort from both conflicting parties supported by the international community according to the Security Council resolutions 242 and 2334. We urge the parties to continue the constructive dialogue towards this goal while respecting the two-state principle. I thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco al
I thank the
representante de
representative of
Mozambique por su
Mozambique for his
declaración.
statement.
Tiene ahora la palabra
I
el
now give the
representante
floor
del
to the
Reino Unido.
representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. A humanitarian catastrophe is unfolding in Gaza, and the intense suffering of innocent Palestinian civilians shows no sign of abating. Israel is reckoning with the brutal horror of the 7 October attacks. More than 130 hostages continue to be held by Hamas, and just this morning I met with the parents of one girl still held hostage. I will carry their words with me for a long time. As my Prime Minister has said, we need a sustainable ceasefire that breaks the cycle of violence. Hamas must stop firing rockets into Israel. All hostages must be released, and aid must flow into Gaza. This is the only way to achieve a sustainable peace based on a two-state solution in which Israelis and Palestinians can live in peace and security. President, we are focused on 3 areas. First, too many civilians have been killed. Israel must be targeted and precise in its efforts to address the threat posed by Hamas, and should do more to discriminate sufficiently between terrorists and civilians. Civilian infrastructure must be protected in line with international humanitarian law. The Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary have repeatedly delivered this message to Israel, and we will continue to do so. Second, we need to continue to work on increasing the amount of humanitarian support into Gaza through as many direct routes as possible. The agreement to open Kerem Shalom is welcome. We look forward to its urgent implementation. Israel should also immediately increase the range of humanitarian items allowed into Gaza. Third, as we heard today, in recent months the violence of extremist settlers in the West Bank has dramatically increased. Since 7 October, there have been 8 Palestinians killed by Israeli settlers, including 1 child, and at least 1,257 displaced amid settler violence and access restrictions. We strongly condemn these hateful acts which undermine prospects for peace. We are banning those responsible for settler violence from entering the UK to make sure our country cannot be a home for people who commit these intimidating acts. Israel must also do more to hold perpetrators of settler violence to account and to end the demolition and confiscation of Palestinian property. And we reiterate our call on Israel to immediately and completely stop all settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem and its lower aqueduct. We are clear, these settlements are illegal under international law, present an obstacle to peace, and threaten the physical viability and delivery of a two-state solution, which must become a reality to ensure justice and peace for Palestinians and Israelis. I thank you.
Agradezco al
I thank the
representante del Reino
representative
Unido
of the
por su
United Kingdom for
declaración.
his statement.
Tiene ahora la
I now
palabra el
give the floor to the
representante de China.
representative of China.
主席先生，
Mr. President,
我感谢温尼斯
I
兰
thank
的特别
Special
协调员
Coordinator
和
Winnis
包察
Land
少
and
将
Major
刚
General
才所做
Gocha
的通报。
for their briefings that were just
新一
delivered.
轮巴以冲突
Nearly
爆发
80
已
days
近
into the
80
new
天，
outbreak of the
加
Israeli-Palestinian
沙
conflict,
200多万无
more
辜
than
民众
2 million
遭
innocent
受
people in
前所
Gaza
未有的
have
人
been
道灾难。
suffering from unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe. On the 11th of December, thanks to the arrangements made by the governments of the UAE and Egypt, I visited the Al Arish and Rafah crossings together with the ambassadors of a number of council members
对加沙人道灾难
and
有了更
gained a
切身的
hands-on
感受。
experience of the humanitarian disaster in
埃及等
Gaza.
国家
Egypt
为
and other
缓解
countries
加沙人道
have
局
made
势
tremendous
做出
efforts
了巨
to
大的努力，
alleviate the humanitarian situation on the ground,
但仍面临重重
but
困难。
they still face many
一边
difficulties.
是加
On the
沙
one
民
hand,
众
the
断
people of
水断
Gaza
电，
have no access to
没有
water,
食物、
electricity,
燃
food,
油、
fuel,
药品，
medicine.
缺乏起码的
They
生
simply
存物
lack
资。
the minimum
另
supplies
一
for
边是
survival.
大量
On
运输物
the
资
other
的
hand,
卡
a
车
large number of trucks
在排
delivering
队等候，
supplies are waiting in line,
堆积在阿里什仓库
while
里
the
的物
supplies
资
piled up at the
不能
warehouses in Al
及时
Arish
送到有需
cannot
要
be
的
delivered
民
in
众手
time
上。
to the people in need.
更令人担忧的
What
是，
is even more worrying
由于
is
以
that
色列无差别的
due to Israel's
轰炸，
indiscriminate
人员
bombardment,
安全得不到保障。
the humanitarian relief
联合国机
network,
构在加
comprising
沙
a
的
number of
人
UN
道救
agencies
助网
operating
络
Gaza,
已濒临
is on the
瘫痪。
verge of paralysis, and the safety and security of their
在
personnel
此情况
cannot be
下，
guaranteed.
阿联酋代
In
表
this
阿拉伯国
context,
家
the
提出
UAE, on
新
behalf
的
of the
安理会
Arab
决议
states,
草
has
案，
tabled the draft
旨在
text of
消
a new
除
council
人道损
resolution
入瓶颈，
aimed at removing
缓
bottlenecks
解加
to
沙的人道
humanitarian
灾难。
access and alleviating the
阿联
humanitarian
酋就
disaster
决
in
议草案
Gaza.
内容
The
同各成
UAE
员
has held
进行了广
extensive
泛磋商，
consultations with council members on the
并
draft
听取
text
联合国人道
and
机构
has
意
listened
见，
to the views and opinions of
得
UN
到绝大
humanitarian
多数成员的
agencies
支持。
and has gained the support of the
中
majority of
方
council
参加了
members.
决议草
China
案的
has
共提。
participated, has joined
面对这份决议草
in
案，
the co-sponsorship of
任
the
何国家
draft resolution. We
没有
believe
任
that
何理由犹豫不决。
no country should be hesitant out of
我
any
们
reason
敦促
regarding this
有
draft
关成员
resolution.
秉持建设
We
性态
urge
度，
relevant council members to
支持
take
安
a
理会
constructive
为
approach
拯救生
and
命
support
采取有意
the
义
council
的
in
行
taking
动。
meaningful,
应该看到，
life-saving, and immediate
阿联酋
actions.
的决议
It
草
should be
案
noted
是为
that
应
the
对当前
UAE's
加沙
draft
人道灾
resolution
难
is an emergency
解
initiative
燃眉之急的紧急
to
举
address
措。
the immediate urgent needs arising from the current humanitarian
面对加
disaster in
沙冲
Gaza.
突持续延宕，
Facing the prolonged
约旦
Gaza
河西岸局势不
conflict
断升
and
级
the，escalations in
安
the
理
West
会必
Bank,
须
the
进一
Council
步发
must
挥
further
应
play
有
its
作用，
due role
为早日停
and
火止战、
take
恢
action
复地
for
区和
realizing
平、
a ceasefire and
维
cessation
护
of
公平正义
hostilities an early
采
date
取行
for
动。
restoring regional peace and for upholding fairness and justice.
第一，实现停火
First,
仍是压倒一
The
切的前提。
realization of a ceasefire
只
remains
有
the
停火
overriding
才能避免
prerequisite.
更大的
Only
平
a
民，
ceasefire
包括
can
人
prevent
质
greater
伤
civilian
亡。
casualties,
只
including
有
those
停
of
火才能
hostages.
避免
Only a
地区冲
ceasefire
突走
can
向失
prevent
控。
the regional conflict from
只有停
spiraling
火
out
才
of
能避
control.
免政治
And
解
only a
决前
ceasefire
景
can
彻
prevent
底
the
丧
prospects of a political
国
solution
际社会
from
已
being
经一
completely
再
killed.
发出压倒性
The
呼吁，
international community has repeatedly and
要求在加沙
overwhelmingly
立即停
called
火。
for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza.
然而，以
Yet,
色列仍在持续实施
Israel
轰炸
continues
和
its
炮击，
bombing and shelling. Schools, hospitals, mosques, Christian churches, and refugee camps have been repeatedly targeted in military operations, and there can be no justification for such attacks. It must be pointed out that causing more civilian casualties in Gaza will not hold the solution for rescuing the hostages, nor will it lead to greater security for any party. We urge Israel to immediately reverse its course of action and stop its indiscriminate military attacks and collective punishment against the people of Gaza. Second, every effort must be made to prevent the West Bank situation from getting out of control. While the eyes of the international community are focused on Gaza, violence committed by the Israeli army and settlers in the West Bank has intensified. Searches, arrests, and attacks against Palestinians happen on a daily basis with appalling frequency and intensity, and have resulted in a large number of Palestinian casualties. Settlement of activities violate international law and Council Resolution 2334 and continue to erode the foundation of the two-state solution. We urge Israel, as the occupying power, to comply with its obligations under international law, cease all settlement activities, and effectively curb settler violence so as to put an end to impunity. Third, the two-state solution must be revitalized with maximum political determination. The two-state solution is the only way out for resolving the Israeli-Palestinian issue. It is also the broad consensus of the international community. The main reason that the Israeli-Palestinian issue has long failed to be resolved is precisely because the two-state solution has not been implemented. We are extremely concerned about the recent public rejection of the two-state solution by some political leaders. China calls for greater international and regional diplomatic efforts to reaffirm the commitment to the two-state solution, revitalize the political prospects of the two-state solution, and restart direct negotiations between Palestine and Israel. Undoubtedly, any solution to the question of Palestine should respect the will of the Palestinian people and the legitimate concerns of the countries of the region, and should not deviate from the basic direction of the two-state solution. China calls for the convening of an international peace conference that is larger in scale, scope, and effects, and for the formulation of a timetable and a roadmap so that the two-state solution can truly be realized. Thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco al
I
representante
thank the
de China por
representative
su
of China for
declaración.
his statement.
Tiene ahora la
I now
palabra
give
la
the floor to the
representante de Malta.
representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. I thank Special Coordinator Wennesland for his report on the implementation of Resolution 2334. I also thank Major General Patrick Gaushev for his briefing. Since the Council's last meeting on this resolution in September, the situation has deteriorated on all fronts. We have witnessed an unprecedented scale of death and destruction in the occupied Palestinian territory and in Israel, the consequences of which will no doubt reverberate for years to come. This year, the intensification of deadly violence against civilians in the region, including acts of terror, has skyrocketed. This unyielding cycle of violence has pushed us further away from a political horizon than in any point in recent history. It is painfully clear that the conflict in Gaza is taking an unimaginable toll on the population. A shocking number of civilians have been killed and displaced. Countless others continue to face the denial of basic necessities. Malta stresses that respect for international humanitarian law is paramount. All parties are obliged to ensure that civilians and civilian infrastructure are protected. A significant scale-up of humanitarian aid to Gaza is desperately needed, including through the opening of further crossing points. This must happen in tandem with assurances for the safety of UN and humanitarian workers, including of their premises. The rising death toll of humanitarian and UNRWA staff is completely unacceptable, and attacks on religious sites and persons seeking refuge within are also unacceptable, as is the number of journalists that have been killed in this conflict. Malta stresses that an immediate humanitarian ceasefire is now an imperative to ensure the necessary protection of civilians and de-escalate this conflict. We continue to strongly condemn the unjustifiable Hamas terror attack of 7th October. Indiscriminate rocket fire and acts of sexual violence are equally condemnable. We reiterate our calls on Hamas to release the remaining hostages immediately and unconditionally in accordance with Resolution 2712. We also underline the urgency for humanitarian actors to be allowed access to the remaining hostages as long as they are held captive. Too many women and children on both sides continue to unjustly suffer the consequences of this conflict. Children have been abducted and are being killed and maimed at staggering rates. Children face heightened risks of malnutrition, severe illness, dehydration, and psychological trauma. They deserve our undisputed protection. We commend UNICEF staff and their partners for providing life-saving aid and psychosocial support to all children, in particular inside Gaza, in extremely difficult circumstances. We also underline that attacks by Israeli settlers against Palestinian residents and properties in the West Bank are inexcusable. Such acts must not be allowed to take place with impunity. Settlements, demolition of homes, and displacement of Palestinians violate international law and Resolution 2334. They constitute an obstacle to peace, inflame tensions, and threaten the viability of an independent, contiguous Palestinian state. We reiterate our strong opposition to Israel's settlement policy and actions advancing settlements in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. President, urgent steps must be taken to prevent regional escalation and to relaunch credible negotiations and engagement between both parties. A meaningful political horizon cannot be achieved unless we ensure that the Palestinian Authority has the fiscal stability and support it needs. Malta reaffirms its commitment to a just and comprehensive resolution of the conflict based on a two-state solution along the pre-1967 borders, addressing the legitimate aspirations of both sides, with Jerusalem as the future capital of two states, living side by side in peace and security, in line with the relevant Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. It has never been more critical that the international community engages in meaningful, peace-forward efforts, placing regional stakeholders at the forefront of any deliberations and addressing the core issues of this conflict. We cannot return to an unsustainable status quo. The violence and suffering must stop. I thank you.
Agradezco a la
I thank the
representante de Malta
representative
por
of
su
Malta for her
declaración.
statement.
Tiene ahora la palabra
I now
el
give the
representante de
floor
la
to
Federación
the
Rusa.
representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель,
Mr. President,
благодарим
we would like
спецкоординатора
to
по
thank the special
ближневосточному
coordinator for
мирному
the Middle
процессу
East
Тора
peace process,
Венесланда и главу органа ООН по
and the
наблюдению за
head of
выполнением
the
условий
United Nations
перемирия
Truth
Патрика
Supervision
Гоша
Organization mission,
за
Mr.
оценки
Gosha. We
ситуации на
thank them for the
оккупированных
overview of the
палестинских территориях,
situation
на
in the
которых вот
occupied
уже
Palestinian
2,5
territories,
месяца
where for
продолжается
2.5 months we
беспрецедентная
have
по
been
масштабам
witnessing an
война.
unprecedented, in the number of victims massacre. Since the last meeting on the Council on this issue on the 8th of December, 10 days have elapsed, and the number of its victims in this time has grown further. To date, since the beginning of the Israeli military operation in Gaza, about 19,000 people lost their lives. 70% of them are women and children. 90% of the Gaza population, about 2 million people, have become internally displaced. The victims of indiscriminate Israeli actions is also amongst Israeli hostages. Add to that the total blockade of Gaza, including downed comms, harsh restrictions on humanitarian aid supplies. There is an acute shortage in the strip of water, fuel, medicines, and the civic order, and on the brink of collapse. WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom confirms that no one is safe in Gaza. Out of 36 medical facilities, until recently, only 8 functioned partially, but they didn't have water or electricity. There is an illustration also here through the number of staff killed. The ICRC and UN staff were killed together with their families, including babies. Under attack, including repeated attack, are about 90 UN facilities, 133 staff of the organization were killed, and this, according to the UN data, is the largest single loss the U.S. has ever suffered. The head of OCHA, Martin Griffiths, said the disaster in the strip is the worst he's ever seen, especially taking into account that people have nowhere to go, and the stated goal of eliminating Hamas cannot be implemented. According to mass media, Israel dropped about 29,000 air bombs on Gaza, which is comparable to the number dropped by the U.S. and UK throughout their entire military aggression in Iraq in 2003. We have received shocking news from the Latin Patriarchate in Jerusalem on the 16th of December during the Holy Family festivities in church, which was a refuge for many families. An Israeli sniper killed 2 Christians. 7 more people were wounded as they tried to protect their loved ones. According to witness account, there were no warnings issued to that. On the same day, Israel had an airstrike against the monastery of Mother Teresa, which was marked as a shelter since the beginning of the escalation. And such attacks continue at the time when everyone is preparing for the Christmas celebrations on the 25th of December. Mr. President, against the background of disaster in Gaza, what we have somewhat in the background in the news is what is happening in the West Bank, whereas violence rages there as well. There are continued armed raids by Israel and brutal attacks by Israeli settlers. As a result of an Israeli incursion into Nur Shams camp, 5 Palestinians were killed in the last 24 hours, and the day before, another Palestinian was killed in the Farah camp. Therefore, since the 7th of October, the overall number of victims of the so-called Israeli operations of the West Bank is at least 293 people. And in this context, we would like to underscore the fact that the clearing of the West Bank is something that Israel has been doing for a long time, even before 7th October. And then there was no link with terror threats or security issues, which is a slogan that the West of Jerusalem is using for its unprecedented in scope operation in Gaza. In parallel to that, in the West Bank, there is a demolition of Palestinian houses without construction permits, and it's virtually impossible to receive such a permit. There is also continued settlement policy prosecuted by the Western Jerusalem, including funding for the expanded settlements. Such plans are being approved by the Israeli authorities in parallel with the planned destruction of Gaza. Mr. President, the scope of humanitarian disaster in the area of conflict compelled the Secretary General to invoke his powers under Article 99 of the Charter and call on the Council to pass a decision on ending the bloodbath. But despite the efforts made by the absolute majority of Security Council members, all of the drafts submitted were blocked by Washington. Washington, instead of helping civilians, is providing Israel massively with all kinds of weapons which are used to kill Palestinian civilians. Currently, everyone should understand that the stalling of collective UN efforts is not a result of some kind of objective institutional issues, but rather as a result of stubborn and egotistical ambitions on the part of American leadership. It will not be an exaggeration to say that there is a consensus in the world about the need to have an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza, and the only state besides Israel which stands against this, pitting themselves against the entire international community, is the United States. After the tragic events on the 7th of October, the policy of Washington in the region has reached a strategic impasse. The Hamas raid, for which there is no and cannot be a justification, cannot be considered separately for what Israel is doing to construct and expand settlements on Palestinian territories, or separate from the failed policy by the U.S. aimed at ignoring the Palestinian issue, ignoring the aspirations for their own state, and their work to undermine the international basis for the Middle East settlement, including a two-state solution. With Washington's assist, the UN resolutions pledging a state for the Palestinians are being stonewalled by Israel for more than a decade against a background of illegal expansion of settlements and seizing of Palestinians' land and property. This is a background, also the blockade of Gaza, and against this background we have several generations of Gazans grown up against that. Our position has been consistent. We cherish our historically close relationship with the Palestinians and Israelis alike. We condemn any kind of act of terror or indiscriminate use of force against civilians and civilian infrastructure. We advocate the end of hostilities in Gaza, ensuring the safety of civilians and the release of those detained. At the same time, we're consistent in our advocacy for the creation of an independent and viable Palestinian state within 1967 borders, with the capital in East Jerusalem coexisting in peace and security with Israel. Our approach is based on the international legal basis for the Middle East settlement, including the resolutions passed by the General Assembly and Security Council. Furthermore, we call for the implementation of the only to-date product that Security Council has on Gaza, Resolution 2712, which, as weak as it is, at least contains a mandatory for implementation, appeals to parties to establish humanitarian pauses. There has to be an international monitoring of the implementation of the Security Council decision on the UN aegis. We're grateful to Secretary General for working through the options for this monitoring. We are studying them very closely, and we expect that the Council in the very near future will decide on the option to choose and will pass a decision on that in a resolution. I thank you.
Agradezco al representante de la Federación
I
Rusa
thank the
por
representative
sus
of the Russian
declaraciones.
Federation for his
Tiene ahora la
statement.
palabra
I now give the floor to the
la
representative
representante de Ghana.
of Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, let me thank Special Coordinator Mr. Tor Winnisland and Major General Patrick Bouchard for their briefing. We welcome the Secretary General's report on the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334, which addresses some of the crucial issues surrounding the Middle East peace process. We regret that the prospect for our collective aspiration for the two-state solution continues to be obscured by the current highly degenerative environment in the Gaza Strip. Mr. President, the briefings we have just received paint a gloomy picture as far as the two-state solution is concerned. We know that actions on the ground by both Israelis and Palestinians are counterproductive to the search for a lasting peace in the Middle East. We reiterate our position that violence has never been successful as a tool for the resolution of any conflict and will not be in the ongoing conflict. We are equally distressed about the appalling humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip and other parts of the occupied Palestinian territories, which seems to deteriorate on a daily basis as the war lingers on. We call for the respect of international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and the protection of all civilians and civilian infrastructure. We, however, welcome the gesture by the Israeli government to open its border crossing at Kerem Shalom for direct delivery of humanitarian assistance and supplies to the ever-increasing number of internally displaced people in Gaza, including women, children, and the elderly who desperately need them. Mr. President, as a Council, we must do everything within our means to bring the hostilities to an end and give peace a chance. We must also recognize and accept the importance of resuming the stalled peace process. It is our firm belief that the resumption of the peace process will promote confidence-building measures and provide for a peaceful and lasting resolution of the question of Palestine, based on the principles of international law and relevant UN resolutions. In closing, I wish to reiterate Ghana's commitment to continue supporting a meaningful peace process, which would eventually provide the potential pathways towards resolving the long-standing Israeli-Palestinian conflict and ensuring the fulfillment of the rights and aspirations of both Israelis and Palestinians for the prosperity of the peoples of the wider Middle East region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France. Thank you, President. I'd like to thank Tor Wennesland and General Gaucha for their briefings. President, the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza should not lead us to forget that Israeli settlement building is continuing and even accelerating in the West Bank. France reiterates its strong condemnation of this illegal policy under international law. It contravenes several resolutions of this Council, notably 2334. We remind Israel of its obligations under international law, particularly Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. France will never recognize the illegal annexation of territories or the legalization of unauthorized settlements. We reiterate our condemnation of the Israeli decision on the 6th of December to authorize the building of 1,800 new houses in settlements in East Jerusalem. We also strongly condemn the measures of expulsion notified to some families on the 10th of December in the Old City of Jerusalem. These decisions compromise the possibility of establishing a viable and contiguous Palestinian state, and they jeopardize the prospects for a two-state solution, with both having Jerusalem as its capital. Today's priority is to immediately curb these unilateral measures, and France recalls that Resolution 2334 also relates to implementation of differentiation by states between the territory of Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. In line with its obligations, the EU will ensure its strict implementation. We condemn the violence committed by extremist settlers in the West Bank, which terrorizes the Palestinian communities. This must immediately cease, and the perpetrators must be brought to book. Israel's inability to protect Palestinians and to prosecute these extremist settlers has led to an environment of impunity, total impunity, in which violence committed by settlers has reached unprecedented highs. This situation compromises the security in the West Bank and in the region, and threatens prospects for a sustainable peace. On the 15th of December, France, with the UK, Switzerland, and 11 other states, recalled Israel's obligation as the occupying power to protect Palestinian civilians in the West Bank. And we call on the Israeli authorities to bring the perpetrators of violence to justice. We cannot accept these abuses which deprive Palestinians of their rights and their land. This is what the French minister said in her visit to the region on the weekend, and she said that measures will be taken. President, we must urgently restore the prospects for a political solution to implement the two-state solution. The France Foreign Affairs Minister reaffirmed France's solidarity with the people of Israel and our commitments to Israel's security. I recall our strongest possible condemnation of the sexual and gender-based violence perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October. We call for a new, immediate, lasting humanitarian truce, which must lead to a lasting ceasefire to obtain the liberation of the hostages detained by Hamas and to provide the people of Gaza with the aid that they urgently need. We recall the urgent need for all parties to fully comply with international humanitarian law. France deplores the deaths of thousands of Palestinian civilians, and we condemn the bombing of a building that led to the death of an agent of the Foreign Affairs Minister and many other civilians in Rafah. The Israeli authorities must urgently look into the circumstances of that bombing. President, a The political process must urgently resume. We must work seriously towards building a state for the Palestinians. The Palestinian Authority has a key role to play in this process, in the West Bank and in Gaza, which should be part of this Palestinian state. France is actively mobilized in this regard with the parties and with our regional and international partners. Inertia is not a solution because we have seen that the conflict in Gaza has already had repercussions in the wider region. We must urgently avoid a regional escalation, as the minister recalled in a visit to Lebanon yesterday. France calls on all parties to show responsibility. The stability of southern Lebanon needs the full respect of Resolution 1701 by all parties. We also will continue to mobilize to ensure that there is freedom of navigation of the region as well. We welcome the Security Council's unanimity on that point. Thank you.
Agradezco a la representante de Francia por su declaración. Tiene ahora la palabra la representante de Gabón.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Nous sommes reconnaissants au coordinateur spécial Thor Wennesland et au major général Patrick Gauchat pour leurs exposés édifiants sur la situation qui prévaut à Gaza et dans la région. Trop de morts, de blessés, de vies gâchées, de destins volés au nom d'une guerre qui ne peut pas se gagner par la violence. La guerre qui oppose Israël au Hamas depuis le 7 octobre dernier, nouvelle phase du conflit israélo-palestinien, vieux d'une dizaine d'années, apparaît la plus meurtrière pour les deux camps. Ce bain de sang doit cesser. Nous appelons les autorités israéliennes à la plus grande retenue et à la responsabilité dans la conduite de leurs opérations militaires, conformément au droit international humanitaire. De même, le Gabon exige la libération immédiate et sans condition de tous les otages. Monsieur le Président, alors que la situation se détériore à une échelle sans précédent sur le terrain, les divisions au sein de ce Conseil sont humainement incompréhensibles. L'Assemblée générale a adopté le 12 décembre dernier, à une large majorité, une résolution réclamant notamment un cessez-le-feu humanitaire immédiat à Gaza lors d'une session extraordinaire d'urgence. Le Gabon a voté en faveur de ce projet de résolution. La cessation des hostilités est en effet un préalable à l'accès sécurisé de l'aide humanitaire aux populations civiles dans le besoin. De même, les parties sont encouragées à engager un dialogue constructif pour réactiver un processus de paix à même de parvenir à une solution pacifique au conflit. L'unité du Conseil de sécurité est cruciale pour sauver des vies et se réconcilier avec les obligations souscrites en vertu du droit international humanitaire. Le Gabon a soutenu et soutiendra toute initiative visant à redonner l'espoir de sauver des vies humaines et contribuer à l'amélioration du sort des populations civiles et à la désescalade. Le projet de résolution sur l'augmentation et le suivi de l'aide à Gaza, que nous espérons voir adopté aujourd'hui, offre une opportunité pour notamment la réaffirmation que la bande de Gaza fait partie intégrante du territoire palestinien occupé en 1967 et qu'elle doit faire partie de l'État palestinien. L'appel à une cessation urgente et durable des hostilités afin de permettre un accès humanitaire sûr et sans entrave. L'exigence de la libération immédiate et inconditionnelle de tous les otages. L'exigence de la fourniture du carburant à Gaza à des niveaux permettant de répondre aux besoins humanitaires. Le Gabon soutient la proposition du secrétaire général de mettre en place un mécanisme de surveillance de l'aide humanitaire à Gaza. Nous prenons note également de l'ouverture temporaire d'un port de passage de Kerem Shalom. Monsieur le Président, l'heure est grave. Nous ne pouvons pas nous permettre de demeurer dans l'impasse ou l'immobilisme. Le Gabon, dont le mandat au Conseil de sécurité tire à sa fin, entend jeter ses dernières forces afin de faire taire les armes dans la guerre entre Israël et le Hamas et éviter l'embrasement dans l'ensemble de la région. Parce que le risque d'un embrasement de toute cette région est bien réel. Nous sommes préoccupés par les attaques des Houthis du Yémen contre les navires en mer Rouge.
a vessel in the Red Sea, and the situation between Israel and Lebanon remains very volatile. We call on all parties to exercise restraint and to uphold the obligations they have under international humanitarian law. We also call for the implementation of Resolution 2712, which has given us so much hope in terms of saving human lives, in particular those of children and women. We will continue repeating that the solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has to be a political and diplomatic one, and reach through dialogue and good faith negotiations, ensuring that the legitimate preoccupations of all parties are taken into account. We have to therefore intensify our efforts to find a just and lasting solution to the conflict based on the two-state solution. I thank you.
Agradezco a la representante de Gabón por su declaración. Tiene ahora la palabra el representante de Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President, and let me thank Special Coordinator Wennesland and General Gosha for their remarks. On October 7, innocent people were savagely murdered. Thousands were wounded. Babies, young people and Holocaust survivors were killed. Women and girls were raped. Innocent people were taken hostage. What followed is known by all and continues to this hour. This war and its appalling human toll is a tragedy. Another one on top of so many seen in the past, where civilians always end up paying the high price, especially the children, victims of wars they never choose, of conflicts they cannot understand. We call for the full respect of the international humanitarian law, as we have done at every meeting, which is not an option, but an obligation. Terrorists must be killed, but innocent people, children, civilians and their families, humanitarian workers, UN staff and journalists must be protected. We deplore every innocent life lost in this bloody war, be it Israeli or Palestinian. Innocent life has the same value on any side of this or any border. Mr. President, for an entire week, guns were silenced, reason prevailed, and some 100 hostages were released with a glimpse of hope came back. The world was holding its breath, hoping for the truce to be extended, but Hamas did not see that way, leaving families of hostages in deep anguish, fully aware of what would happen, that more innocent people would be killed and more innocent Palestinians would be sacrificed. We remain worried about the situation of the hostages who are still in the bloody hands of Hamas. Those returned to Israel were malnourished, ill, injured, and in heavy psychological conditions. We reiterate our call for the immediate and unconditional release, and in the meantime, the ICRC must be allowed to visit and check their well-being. Colleagues, along the real war with guns, rockets, and tanks, another frontal clash is happening at the same time, one using tweets, hashtags, and shares, the so-called war with 140 characters, with unfiltered images, raw videos, with hate speech, complot theories, anti-Semitism, sowing more division, spreading more hatred. It would be a tragedy, or another one on top of the one in front of our eyes, that the immense suffering of the citizens of Gaza, the thousands of lives lost, this ocean of human pain on both sides, be used by Hamas to strengthen their narrative. We are afraid that in this black and white context, this may be happening. It must be resisted because it is only a recipe for tragedy. Colleagues, we share the deep concern on the deterioration of the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Despite the amount of aid going through or the deconflicting mechanism in place, the fact is that the situation is very dire and a humanitarian system in pain is struggling to survive. We call for the full implementation of the Resolution 2712 and reiterate the need for urgent measures in order for the aid to reach the civilians as soon as possible and without any hindrance. We support efforts to scale up humanitarian aid and for the monitoring mechanism and all efforts to break up hostilities. We must make sure to put in place a mechanism that helps, facilitates and makes it easy to reach those suffering, not rush into something that, despite the good intentions, may end up producing the opposite, especially for those on the ground. In this respect, we welcome the decision to open the Karim Shalom cross point for humanitarian aid. Mr. President, the situation in the West Bank is another area of concern. The settlers' violence on civilian Palestinians is unacceptable. It must end, and all cases should be properly investigated. We remain worried about the lack of implementation of Resolution 2334. We recall that settlements are in violation of international law. They constitute an obstacle to the two-state solution that they must be dismantled, not expanded. Mr. President, let me conclude with this. Like every other conflict, this one will also end, and we hope as soon as possible. It will leave behind ruins, immense grief, and deep scars. The political and physical reconstruction of Gaza will require new and true efforts. As this may be the last meeting for my country as member of the Council on this issue, just like we have said and repeated in every one of them, we look forward to the moment when the two-state solution is advanced, not like an empty mantra, not as an easy substitute to failure, not as a placebo, but as a genuine process so that the Israelis and Palestinians find the way to get out of the horrible deadlock, of the terrible impasse and the perpetual failures over decades, and together with the international community, design, agree, and implement to live side by side, each in their own state, in dignity, prosperity, and security, free from terror and insecurity. If not, even if this Hamas is dismantled, its ideology will remain, and if it's not abandoned or eradicated, plans will remain dreams, dreams will be crushed, and the harsh and unforgiving reality will perpetuate, and it will be, unfortunately, only a matter of time until the next tragedy unfolds. I thank you.
Agradezco al
I thank the
representante de
representative
Albania
of
por su
Albania for
declaración.
his statement.
Tiene ahora la
I now
palabra
give the floor
el representante
to
de
the
Emiratos Árabes
representative of the
Unidos.
United Arab Emirates.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to extend sincere condolences on behalf of the United Arab Emirates to the government and people of Kuwait on the passing of the late Emir, His Highness Sheikh Nawaf Al-Ahmed Al-Jaber Al-Sabah. He was a true leader, a tireless advocate for peace in the region who championed humanitarian causes around the world. His loss will be felt the world over. Mr. President, I thank our briefers today, Special Coordinator Tor Wennesland and Major General Patrick Gosha, for updating us on the situation on the ground. We are now coming to the end of what was the deadliest year in the occupied Palestinian territory. This should be a wake-up call that the current status quo cannot be allowed to continue, and this starts with the current situation in Gaza. Last week, many Security Council members witnessed a humanitarian system at its breaking point at the Rafah crossing. They saw thousands of trucks and warehouses filled with aid from people and governments around the world, the physical expression of their solidarity with the people of Gaza. Meanwhile, just over the border, 2.2 million people remain trapped, with 9 out of every 10 spending entire days without food. Gazans are experiencing unprecedented levels of starvation and thirst, while doctors lack even the most basic of medical supplies to treat the wounded and the growing threat of infection. What we need is access. The resolution that we will vote on later today aims to meet this need by demanding the use of all land, sea, and air routes to allow aid to enter. Israel must stop blocking the entry of aid and allow life-saving assistance into the Gaza Strip. The UAE notes the opening of the border crossing at Karam Abu Salim. We call on authorities to ensure its full opening, including to commercial cargo, so that aid can enter at scale. The entry of aid alone is not enough. Aid workers must not have to pay the ultimate price to carry out their life-saving work, and those accessing the aid must be able to do so without fearing for their safety. This is why we need the urgent and extended pauses and corridors throughout the Gaza Strip as called for in Resolution 2712. Monitoring and verification are key to implementation. We welcome the Secretary General's letter to the Council yesterday providing options. We look forward to discussing these with fellow members of the Council and to their further elaboration by the UN Secretariat. Mr. President, a humanitarian ceasefire remains a fundamental necessity to bring the suffering in Gaza to an end. It will stop the bloodshed, allow for the safe and unhindered access for humanitarian aid, and offer an opportunity for hostages to be brought to safety. Meanwhile, less than 100 kilometers away from Gaza, people in the West Bank are living in a situation of violence and fear that has escalated over the past 2 months. Since 7 October, the number of people killed in the West Bank has increased. 278 Palestinians, including 70 children, have lost their lives. This is more than half of the total number since the beginning of the year, in a year that was already witnessing unprecedented levels of violence. The level of settler violence is disturbing and unrelenting, with 344 Israeli settler attacks against Palestinians in the past 2 months. This is unacceptable and must be stopped. Just because those with extremist voices shout the loudest does not mean that they should decide the fate of the region. We are also deeply concerned about reports of Israel approving a new illegal settlement in East Jerusalem, including 1,700 units. We reject and condemn in the strongest possible terms any attempt to exploit the ongoing war on Gaza to expand settlements and displace Palestinians from their land. This is also a grave violation of Resolution 2334. Not just an indictment of settlements, 2334 renewed the Council's commitment to the two-state solution and the parameters necessary for peace between Israelis and Palestinians. The violence we are witnessing now across Gaza and the West Bank is a direct result of the lack of full implementation of 2334 and the absence of any meaningful political process. The past 2 months have made this crystal clear, as well as underlining the urgency of resolving the Palestinian question, a matter of priority for all of us. This is why we need a comprehensive, just, and lasting solution. The international community's commitment to the two-state solution is a responsibility we must all bear and a call to action we must all heed. Thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco al representante de Emiratos Árabes Unidos por su declaración. A continuación, formularé una declaración en calidad de representante del Ecuador. Agradezco al coordinador especial Tor Wensland y al general Patrick Gauchat por sus intervenciones de esta mañana, así como a la Secretaría por el informe que ha transmitido sobre la aplicación de la Resolución 2334. Reitero el apoyo de mi país para el trabajo de las Naciones Unidas tan valioso y sacrificado. El secretario general, en su informe, describe este último trimestre como el periodo más mortífero para israelíes y palestinos en la historia de este conflicto y hace un recuento de la explosión de violencia que inició el 7 de octubre pasado con los execrables ataques terroristas de Hamas y ha continuado hasta el momento con gravísimas, catastróficas consecuencias para la población civil y la situación humanitaria. Este informe es un documento sombrío que desearíamos nunca haber recibido y que además de la situación de Gaza da cuenta del alarmante incremento de la violencia en Cisjordania, en ocasiones perpetrada por colonos, de la continuación de actividades de asentamientos ilegales y del incremento de la retórica incendiaria, los actos de provocación y de incitación, incluyendo la inaceptable glorificación del asesinato de civiles y de los actos terroristas. En definitiva, el informe es la síntesis de un periodo aciago de terror, odio, violencia y muerte, y es al mismo tiempo una advertencia y un llamado a la acción. Excelencias, colegas, hace pocos días tuve la oportunidad de visitar el paso de Rafah, en el límite entre Egipto y Gaza, junto con otros representantes, miembros actuales y entrantes del Consejo, y por iniciativa de la delegación de Emiratos Árabes Unidos y en coordinación con Egipto, a los que agradezco, pude constatar personalmente la gravedad y la urgencia de la situación humanitaria. Es necesario y apremiante continuar con nuestros esfuerzos para aliviar el sufrimiento de los civiles en Gaza, para lo cual consideramos indispensable un cese al fuego humanitario que permita incrementar el ingreso y la distribución de ayuda. Es nuestro deber hacer todo lo posible para evitar más casos como el de Wala, joven palestina, madre de un hijo muerto y otro herido, a quien conocí en un hospital de Egipto durante mi viaje. En este sentido, la resolución 2712, al igual que todas las resoluciones de este Consejo, deben ser completadas e implementadas inmediatamente. Es, asimismo, necesario prevenir la expansión de la violencia a otras zonas, para lo cual es imprescindible evitar los actos de incitación, el lenguaje de odio y la glorificación de la violencia. Llamamos a que los líderes demuestren responsabilidad y humanidad. Como acertadamente señala el secretario general en su informe, los líderes tienen la obligación de condenar clara y explícitamente los actos de terror y violencia contra civiles, clara y explícitamente. Adicionalmente, vemos con preocupación un incremento del discurso de odio, de la islamofobia y del antisemitismo en varias partes del mundo. Esto es inaceptable. Una vez más, apelamos a la racionalidad y a la responsabilidad de todos para evitar propagar desinformación y hostilidad. Excelencias. Para finalizar, mi país reitera su compromiso con la paz, su llamado a un cese al fuego humanitario y su condena a los actos terroristas de Hamas y a la violencia contra los civiles, así como su demanda de la liberación inmediata e incondicional de todos los rehenes. Asimismo, reitera su convencimiento de que la única manera de terminar con este conflicto es a través de una solución pacífica, negociada, definitiva y justa para las partes, con la existencia de dos estados, Palestina e Israel, sobre la base de las fronteras de 1967 y de las resoluciones relevantes. Retomo ahora mis funciones como presidente del Consejo. Y no hay más intervenciones en la lista. Invito ahora a los miembros del Consejo a celebrar consultas cerradas para proseguir con el examen del tema. Se levanta la sesión.